The most iconic moment in The Wizard of Oz is tied up in one of the biggest lies that movies tell us.
Toto? I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
I come from Kansas, and while it's nice to know that Dorothy loves her home as much as I do,
There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
it's no particular secret that Judy Garland was never really in Kansas to begin with.
There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
Kansas is a place that doesn't appear much in the movies to begin with, and when it is depicted, some other place usually stands in for it.
There's no place like home. So where am I? There's no place like home.
How loyal should we be to a place when we dramatize it on screen? What is lost when one place stands in for another?
Place like home, right? There's no place.
It has now become unacceptable to say dress up white people in feathers and war paint and pass them off as Native Americans.
There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
So what does it mean when a place gets passed off as another place that may well exist on the other side of the world?
There's no place like home. So where
It's been said that in storytelling, setting begets character and character begets plot. So what goes missing from the stories we tell about the world when one place stands in for another?
like home, right?
My home state makes a good pretext to explore this question since, while there are occasional exceptions, Kansas rarely, if ever, plays itself.
Why?
Our journey begins here, in a Kansas State House of Representatives subcommittee considering tax incentives for filmmakers shooting in the state.
Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of committee. My name is Kristen Bush.
The woman testifying here isn't famous, but you may have seen her before on shows like Law and Order SVU, or The Good Wife, or Suits, or NCIS. These shows are set in places like New York and Chicago and D.C., urban places that frequently figure in the stories America tells about itself. In 2023, Kristen Bush resolved to shoot her own film in Kansas, in part because she rarely saw her home state depicted on screen.
When I'm asked where I'm from, people invariably make a Dorothy joke. That happened just last week. And while I wholeheartedly agree that there's no place like home, I'm frustrated that the only cinematic reference that people have for our state is an 84-year-old movie that was shot on a soundstage in Southern California.
Of course, filmmakers who are given tax incentives to shoot in a given place don't necessarily deepen the way that place is depicted on screen, as Canadian editor Tony Zhou pointed out in this video essay about his own hometown.
This is Vancouver, where I grew up. If you watch enough TV shows or blockbusters, then chances are you've seen my city, disguised as Santa Barbara, or as Seattle, and even one time as the Bronx.
Something's always happening here. That's New York for you. You'll get used to it.
To Hollywood, Vancouver is a location, but not a setting. It's a place with talent and scenery and tax incentives, but almost no film identity of its own. Just other identities it can borrow.
Zhou makes a good point here about the way places end up being depicted or not depicted in movies, and it could be said that I'm stealing the format for my video essay from him, but I'm not. We're actually both stealing the format from a film that appeared 12 years before Zhou's.
This is the city, Los Angeles, California. They make movies here. I live here. Sometimes I think that gives me the right to criticize the way movies depict my city. I know it's not easy. The city's big. The image is small.
This now iconic video essay was written and produced by a film critic named Thom Andersen, who grew up in Los Angeles and bristles at the way that Hollywood movies have saddled his city with certain cinematic cliches.
One of the glories of Los Angeles is its modernist residential architecture. But Hollywood movies have almost systematically denigrated this heritage by casting many of these houses as the residences of movie villains.
Los Angeles plays itself as a 3-hour masterclass in the nuances of architecture and urban design. These are clearly the fixations of the man who created it, But at no point do we learn much about who Thom Andersen is. This feels like a weakness in what is otherwise a brilliant video essay. Even his essay's narration was voiced by another man.
Psycho kidnappers led by John Cassavetes.
I tend to be suspicious of any essay that obscures the person who's writing it, especially an essay that uses a personal connection to geography to argue for the importance of place in storytelling. So, let me tell you a little bit about myself. This is me, or at least it was me, in 1996, just before I moved from Kansas to South Korea to teach English. Since it felt like movies hadn't properly shown the state where I grew up, I decided to make my own video to show my students what it looked like.
Yeah. This is my grandfather. He's gonna be 79, probably by the time you see this. But he's still running all over the place and getting into all kinds of trouble.
Yeah, you ain't a kid.
Right. And
he's taking pictures right now?
Oh yeah, he's videotaping it.
Oh shit.
So
he's crazier than I thought he was.
Yeah, he was. So Grandpa here was born in New Mexico, and he's been living in Kansas ever since he was 11 years old. And he's a farmer, and he's growing just a little bit of everything. And why don't you say something to the kids in Korea?
I wouldn't know what to say. I can't talk Korean.
Can't talk Korean.
I guess we all do this now. We make videos to show other people what it's like in the place where we live. But this is a very recent thing. At the time I made this VHS tape for my Korean students, I lived in Wichita, a mid-sized industrial city of about 300,000 people. I shot this video because, so far as I knew at the time, my hometown had never been certified by a movie.
This is a good typical Midwestern American industrial town.
To clarify what I mean when I say certify, in Walker Percy's 1961 novel The Moviegoer, there's a scene where the main character watches a movie called Panic in the Streets, which was set in New Orleans where he lives. Seeing his own city on the big screen fills him with a strange sense of excitement, since it, quote, certifies that he lives in a place that is somewhere, as opposed to anywhere, or even worse, nowhere. I've since come to learn that by 1996, Wichita had been certified by a handful of cowboy movies, none of which I'd seen, and none of which were filmed in Wichita, which meant that, for the most part, my childhood hometown existed in movies not as a setting, but as a passing reference evoking an obscure and distant place.
Here you go.
Wichita, Kansas? You're a little out of your jurisdiction, don't you think, Toto?
Hey, did you ever pretend there's like murderers chasing you and you're trying to see how fast you can get your keys out and get into your apartment?
I'm from Wichita's.
I'm to drive you to Wichita to catch a train?
Yeah, we'd appreciate it.
Train don't run out of Wichita. Unless you're a hog or a cattle.
Even when these movies do make it to Wichita, my hometown is depicted as a place that exists in contrast to some more important waypoint.
I'm in Wichita.
Wichita, Kansas? Are you all right? What happened?
We couldn't land in Chicago.
And when Wichita is the main setting for a movie, it can be astonishing how little interest the filmmakers have for the actual city.
Does this mean you're rich, Charlie? Because if you are, we could run away together.
It is a thought.
Leaving Wichita? Damn right it's a thought.
Most people don't know that Wichita and Wichita Falls are two different places. Wichita is in Kansas and Wichita Falls is in Texas. I realized no one knows what Wichita looks like. I couldn't even find any pictures of Wichita, you know? And I realized I think Wichita looks like the Chicago suburbs.
The way places are depicted in the media doesn't just concern me in relation to the place where I grew up. Depicting places has, in a way, become my career.
Over the past decade, I've been fortunate enough to have some pretty amazing adventures in different parts of the world, including 7 years of living and traveling in Asia. I drove a Land Rover across the Americas for 3 months. I've been to Africa for the New York Times Magazine. I've been to Australia for Slate. I've been to the Falkland Islands for National Geographic Traveler. I've appeared as an expert on the Travel Channel and talked about independent travel in places like the Do Lectures in Wales and the Authors at Google in New York. But all of those far-flung travels had one thing in common. I brought luggage. And the more I've traveled, the more I've thought, dumbass, what dog jumped out the window?
By the time I made this video, I'd recently moved back to Kansas. not to my childhood hometown, but to a rural area 90 miles north of Wichita, where I still base myself when I'm not traveling. Travel writing is a complicated and at times ethically dubious profession for a number of reasons, including the fact that travel media exists in a weird relationship with the travel industry, and the travel industry markets places based on expectations that have, as we noted earlier, been created by popular depictions of those places in other mediums, most notably the movies.
Tahiti, for generations the dream island of the Western world, a land of easygoing, fun-loving people. A land that has always represented escape from civilization. A land where there is no time, no tomorrow, only today.
Just as a Marlon Brando movie created a thriving tourist market for Matavai Bay, Tahiti, a Leonardo DiCaprio movie attracted so many visitors to Maya Bay, Thailand, that its beaches had to be closed to outsiders for 4 years so that its ecosystem could recover from over-tourism. An irony here is that in 1999, the producers of the beach imported 100 coconut palms from the Thai mainland to plant in the sands of Maya Bay, in the hopes of creating a more cinematic vision of what a beach in Thailand should look like. Just as, in 1961, Mutiny on the Bounty producers imported tons of white sand from New Jersey to make Tahiti live up to certain fantasies of what a South Pacific beach was supposed to look like. This was nothing new. After scouting movie locations in Scotland, producer Arthur Freed quipped, quote, "I went to Scotland, but I could find nothing that looked like Scotland," end quote. So it was that Brigadoon was shot on an MGM soundstage in Culver City, California. But the way movies project fantasies onto real places can go far beyond cosmetic alterations to real-world locations. When tourists these days travel to the magnificent rock city of Petra in Jordan, they are less likely to imagine the ancient Nabateans who built it than they are to imagine Indiana Jones and his father on a quest to find the Holy Grail. To visit the North African town of Tatooine is in one sense to experience a part of Tunisia, but it also evokes a more famous Tatooine, this one a desert planet that existed a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
So for a Game of Thrones fan, this place is actually super iconic and crazy.
In truth, movies are never fully loyal to places, as is the case with Dubrovnik finding renown as the shooting location of the fictional city of King's Landing. Entire wings of the global tourist trade hinge on exploring landscapes that belong more to the cinematic imaginary than they do to the real world. Even Kansas, my humble home state, has not one but 2 places where tourists can celebrate the Wizard of Oz. One of them, Dorothy's House in the town of Liberal, offers daily tours by local teenagers dressed as the film's protagonist. While on the opposite side of the state, 5 hours away by car, the Oz Museum in Wamego displays memorabilia commemorating the movie. Both Wizard of Oz sites are among the most popular tourist attractions in Kansas, which creates a kind of circular causality, wherein the movie creates a fantasy that the place itself winds up replicating so it can attract tourists. In this way, many landscapes in the world exist as backdrops that certify our fantasies rather than places where people's real lives play out. And that brings us back to Kristen Bush's testimony in front of the Kansas State Legislature in 2023.
Instead of hoping productions will come to Kansas, I've decided to create my own. So this June, I will self-fund, executive produce, and star in The Game Camera, a short film set in Kansas. Were we to shoot this in Oklahoma, we could save an estimated $12,000 against our $60,000 budget, thanks to that state's film incentives. The thing is, I don't want to shoot in Oklahoma and pretend it's Kansas. I want to shoot in my home state, so I will.
I had that dream again. The one where he's alive.
Now, since I previously asserted that no essay should obscure the person who's writing it, I have one more personal detail to share. Kristen Bush, the actress, she's my wife. I call her by her nickname Kiki. I met her in Kansas, where we both grew up. We got married in Kansas, and we lived together in Kansas. I helped her write the script for The Game Camera. Most of the exteriors were shot on our land in north-central Kansas, and while the word Kansas is never mentioned in our short film about a woman dealing with the death of her husband, The Kansas landscape can't be separated from the story we were trying to tell. This is because, when it comes to storytelling, the places where we choose to set our stories should play a dynamic role in what those stories say.
Girl, do you know you're 24 years old and you've never been south of 125th Street? Well, you haven't.
In The Wiz, Motown's 1978 reimagining of The Wizard of Oz, Judy Garland's Kansas farm girl has been replaced by Diana Ross's Harlem schoolteacher, its rural tornado replaced by an urban snowstorm.
Ta-da! Woo! Come on, Dorothy! Come on!
The yellow brick road leads to a landscape that looks a lot like downtown Manhattan, and the Scarecrow is played by Michael Jackson. In her book Imagining the Heartland, anthropologist Britt Halverson posits that this change of setting certified that Motown's rendering of the Oz story was, quote, geographically part of black culture and experience, in contrast to, quote, a white Midwest meant to stand in as a generic backdrop of American existence. The implication here is that by 1978, the black American experience was inseparable from the urban experience, and setting The Wiz in a place like Kansas might have made African American audiences feel like it wasn't really about them. But if the Kansas in The Wizard of Oz has come to represent a generic and saccharine narrative whiteness, then I'd reckon it has a pretty thin relationship to the Kansas that exists in real life.
It's not a place you can get to by a boat or a train. It's far, far away. Behind the moon, beyond the rain, somewhere over the rainbow, way up high.
The 1939 MGM movie that most people associate with The Wizard of Oz was based on a children's novel written by Frank Baum in the year 1900. Baum, who was born in New York and died in California, wrote The Wizard of Oz in Chicago and based its Kansas scenes on his experience of South Dakota a few years earlier. So far as I can tell, Baum had no direct experience of Kansas, nor did anyone involved in the MGM movie that made his story world famous. The Kansas of The Wizard of Oz doesn't really correspond to a geographical or cultural place. It's as fanciful and fantastical as the land of Oz itself. Not a setting so much as a backdrop for the opening act of a story that takes place elsewhere. Dorothy's story may have originated in a children's book published at the turn of the 20th century, but it mirrors a much more ancient narrative template, one that comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell dubbed the hero's journey, a tale which follows its protagonist from a familiar world to an unfamiliar one, where the hero confronts challenges, finds helpers, overcomes tribulations, and returns home transformed. This mythic resonance could well be why the movie has been so beloved for so long. Regardless of where you're from, there's something resonant in the idea of making peace with the world you were born into by escaping that world and all of its limitations and frustrations, pushing your boundaries in a scary and spectacular new place, and getting a new appreciation for what home is in the process. The Wizard of Oz has in fact resonated so deeply for so long that it's woven itself into the very texture of American culture. When the internet was brand new in the 1990s, one of the earliest obsessions of online pop culture message boards was the eerie synchronicity that resulted when you paired The Wizard of Oz with Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon album. The Wizard of Oz has been part of video game culture ever since video games look like this. A technological moment that echoed the kinds of children's stories being told during the advent of full-color animated films half a century earlier. Frank Baum wrote 13 sequels to The Wizard of Oz, and its first adaptation wasn't a movie, but a musical that toured the country in the 1900s and has been reimagined many times in the ensuing century, including, most recently, a West End stage adaptation co-written by Andrew Lloyd Webber. The 1939 Judy Garland movie that everyone associates with The Wizard of Oz wasn't the first time Baum's book was adapted for the silver screen. And in fact, the first movie adaptation of The Wizard of Oz came out a good 12 years before Judy Garland was born. So iconic is its narrative that entire movies have been made about the origin stories of its characters, from the Wizard of Oz himself, to a kind and brave young person who went by the name Elphaba Trot before she became known as the Wicked Witch of the West. But I'm not exploring the Wizard of Oz here. I'm exploring the way places are depicted on screen through the lens of my own home state. In a sense, the Kansas we see in The Wizard of Oz isn't a place so much as an archetype. It's a symbolic stand-in for home, a stable but confining rural place where an orphan living with an adoptive family dreams of broader horizons, which are eventually found in a distant and dangerous and dazzling antipode to home, a fantastical metropolis which is where the real story takes place. This Kansas trope belongs to The Wizard of Oz, but it eventually came to be part of another fantasy franchise that took hold in the American imagination in the late 1930s. A universe where a different orphan lived in Kansas with a different adoptive family before leaving for a different metropolis where the main action of the story takes place. As with Dorothy and The Wizard of Oz, Superman lives in parallel worlds. And just as Dorothy's Kansas exists in contrast to the Land of Oz, Superman's Kansas is as apocryphal as Krypton and Metropolis. The motifs of both franchises have an uncanny similarity in depicting Kansas less as a place than a symbol of generic American virtue.
How do we know you won't one day act against America's interests?
I grew up in Kansas, General. About as American as it gets. Look, I'm here to help.
This takes us back to an important question about the role places play in movies, which is whether or not being, quote, as American as it gets corresponds to an unrealistically wholesome vision of rural Midwestern whiteness. It's worth noting here that a saccharine white vision of the American heartland wasn't restricted to Kansas when it came to 20th century cinema. Even when you narrow this era of American cinema down to the movies that Judy Garland herself made in the wake of The Wizard of Oz. Yet the same year that The Wizard of Oz was nominated for an Academy Award as Best Picture of 1939, that same ceremony saw Hattie McDaniel of South Los Angeles take the Best Supporting Actress Oscar for her role in Gone with the Wind, a first for African-American actors who were rarely given substantial roles in mainstream cinema.
This is one of the happiest moments of my life.
And while the America of Gone with the Wind could be as blindingly white as Hollywood's other fare at the time, a vibrant counter-narrative was being curated by independent black filmmakers, most notably Oscar Micheaux, whose characters live vibrant and prosperous and sometimes troubled lives in cities like New York and Chicago.
If Miss Belwood didn't want to go on these private parties, you know what that means. I wouldn't make her go.
Say, if I had my way, I'd clean up every cabaret like the Poodlock in this town. I stay so annoyed when I have to look upon other girls forced to put up with all they have to that it just makes my blood boil.
One generation after Oscar Micheaux pioneered black films for black audiences, MGM, the company that had produced The Wizard of Oz, distributed a movie made by a black director and starring a black protagonist that harnessed the Black Power movement to create a new kind of action narrative, one that solidified the notion that cities like New York were, to return to a phrase we alluded to earlier, quote, geographically part of black experience.
Good! Get out of the way!
To this day, the word urban is used as a synonym for African American culture. But Shaft wasn't director Gordon Parks' first movie. 2 years earlier, he had made The Learning Tree, a coming-of-age film based on a semi-autobiographical novel of the same name about growing up in rural Kansas. The Learning Tree is about a lot of things, including the fact that, in America, the rule of law doesn't always apply equally to everyone.
What did Papa mean by there'd be trouble if a Negro had killed Mr. Kiner?
Meant just what he said.
Could be real trouble like they had over in Bottsville a couple of years back. Freddie Seal shot a white man who hit his sister. What happened? Well, whites lynched Freddie and burned down half the Negro homes.
But the learning tree also put its black characters at the center of the story, portraying them with a middle American normalcy that Hollywood had previously only afforded its white characters.
Coming to the picnic, I hope?
Hope so. Our cellar's starting piano lessons today. We're going for sheet music.
How nice.
In the learning tree, the notion of what an American community looks like revealed itself to be an ongoing conversation, one that sometimes blurred lines of race and class.
Newt, come here. Want to see some?
And its Kansas landscape appears not as a generic backdrop for saccharine whiteness, but as a dynamic place where black lives can play out in rich and complicated ways. As it happened, Gordon Parks wasn't the only urban filmmaker whose sensibility had been formed in Kansas. Oscar Micheaux, the great independent black director of the early 20th century, spent part of his youth in Great Bend, Kansas, which is where he was laid to rest when he died in 1951. Hattie McDaniel lived in South Los Angeles when she won her Oscar, but she'd spent her childhood in Wichita, where a memorial to her career now sits across the street from her birthplace. In making the learning tree, Gordon Parks sought to evoke a specific moment when black migration to big cities was transforming what life in America looked like. In a very literal way, the learning tree was about how we perceive the places where we live and how we stay in conversation with those places for the rest of our lives, wherever we end up.
Don't you like it here, son?
I don't know. I ain't been no place else.
Well, I hope you won't have to live here all your life. It's not all good place. Not all bad place either. Sort of like fruit on a tree. Some good, some bad. Understand? No matter if you go or stay, think of Cherokee Flats like that till the day you die. Let it be a learning tree.
Indeed, if a setting is going to be more than a trope or an archetype, it needs to flow from a nuanced sense for what that place is like at a certain moment in time. When Kiki set out to make her own film on our land in Kansas, it was, at a very practical level, a way to create work for herself at a point in her career when the entertainment industry, in its own time-honored way, begins to ignore actresses who've reached a certain age. For Kiki, creating an authentic protagonist meant using setting not as a generic backdrop, but as a nuanced landscape where that character can confront the complexities of what it's like to be alive at a certain moment in time. A time when new surveillance technologies have come to alter how we perceive the world around us.
And he will command his angels to guard you.
Angels are a metaphor for something intangible, Anne. Even in the Bible, they aren't something that triggers emotion detecting.
Okay, so it's not an angel. It's Justin in the flesh. Look at him.
For us, where the game camera was set was inseparable from where it was shot, not just because we had access to the location, but because the location itself had provided us with the first kernel of real-life inspiration that eventually led to our story. All of which raises an important question. What, if anything, is lost when movies are set in one place but filmed in another? Wait, one more thing before we go on to the next part. Oscar Micheaux may have spent part of his youth in Kansas, but two other places figure prominently in his early life. One was South Dakota, where, beginning at age 20, he homesteaded a plot of land for the better part of the next decade. This experience led to his first novel, The Homesteader, which in 1919 he made into his first film, shot on location in South Dakota, where he approached filmmaking with the same fortitude and persistence he'd practiced there as a homesteader.
And I think all of that comes from
that experience in South Dakota. You've got to go out in the middle of nowhere. You got to plant your seed. You got to grow the crop, and then you got to harvest it, and then you got to take it to market. I mean, he does all of that with film.
The other essential place in Michaud's early life was the town of Metropolis, Illinois, where he was born. So it was that in 1972, the Illinois State Legislature passed a resolution honoring Metropolis as the childhood home of Superman. That's right, Metropolis, Illinois touts itself as the childhood home of a fictional character who, in the first several decades of his existence, was mainly known as a superhero who came from outer space.
Look, up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's Superman. Yes, it's Superman. Strange visitor from another planet who came to Earth with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men.
Comic books pegged Superman's childhood home to an unspecified town called Smallville as early as the 1940s. But it wasn't until 1978, 6 years after Metropolis, Illinois laid claim to Superman, that a movie depicted Jonathan and Martha Kent discovering a young incarnation of Superman on the Kansas prairie. The original draft of the screenplay, written by Mario Puzo of Godfather fame, was vague about where the Kent family lived. But director Richard Donner, wanting Superman's backstory to be specific yet timeless, placed the Kent family in rural Kansas. Donner's choice wasn't based on a first-hand familiarity with Kansas so much as a desire to evoke a, quote, Norman Rockwell-style aura to Superman's upbringing.
Hey, Clark, let's have all those clothes washed and ready for tomorrow's game,
Yes, sir.
okay? See ya.
Numbered and high!
This gentle vision of a mythic Kansas hometown counterbalanced the hard-edged New York City feel of Metropolis, where a grown-up Clark Kent worked for the Daily Planet newspaper.
Excuse me.
When he wasn't off saving people from deadly peril.
Easy, miss. I've got you.
Of course, the Kansas we see in the Superman movie isn't actually Kansas. Those scenes were shot on location in Alberta, Canada, which takes us back to the question, what, if anything, gets lost when movies are set in one place but filmed in another? To understand why this matters, let's consider this phrase.
We're not in Kansas anymore.
Really?
Lisa works at the MGM Grand. I'm a Dorothy.
Well, we're not in Kansas anymore.
Am I dreaming this?
No, and you ain't in Kansas neither.
You are not in Kansas anymore. You are on Pandora.
What does that mean?
It means buckle your seatbelt, Dorothy, because Kansas is going bye-bye.
Of course, The Wizard of Oz was never really in Kansas to begin with, which hints at how Hollywood has always treated Kansas as an abstraction. To unpack why it is that movies keep doing this, let's go back to what the late director Harold Ramis said about filming The Ice Harvest.
I realized no one knows what Wichita looks like. I couldn't even find any pictures of Wichita, you know? And I realized, I think Wichita looks like the Chicago suburbs.
When I was a teenager in Wichita, the movies I loved about teenagers were John Hughes movies, which were set in the Chicago suburbs.
Oh, you bizarre.
He can't think for himself.
My favorite John Hughes character was Ferris Bueller, who wasn't a stereotypical movie rebel or jock, but a guy unique to himself, a resourceful, tech-savvy, effortlessly charismatic force of personality who cut school one day so that he could take his friends on a fantastic adventure to downtown Chicago. When I was growing up in Wichita, suburban Chicago was an imaginative landscape for a certain kind of teenage life. 10 years after I finished high school, I wrote a screenplay based on my experiences of running on the track team at Wichita North High School. It was inspired by the teen movies of John Hughes, but it didn't look like that world, because my teenage world looked like this. Indeed, to assume that Wichita is like the Chicago suburbs is to completely misunderstand what Wichita is like, at least in the city's industrial north end where I attended high school. The script I wrote reflected the social texture of a place where one might travel from a mostly white neighborhood to a mostly Latino and Asian immigrant neighborhood to a mostly black neighborhood, all in the course of one 4-mile run down North 21st Street. The place that informed my coming-of-age screenplay didn't look much like a John Hughes movie, but the teenagers I knew had dreams and anxieties that rivaled the teenagers I saw in his movies. Kansas never had a John Hughes, but back around the time my father was a teenager, it did have William Inge, whose plays and screenplays drew on what he saw and experienced while growing up in small-town Kansas in the 1920s and 30s.
I'm going to California and live with Aunt Blossom and study art.
Art who?
Inge later said, quote, "I'm one of those people who grew up in Kansas feeling very superior to it. It was boring as hell and I wanted out.
I hate it here. I'm a freak in this town. Everybody stares at me on the street like I was something out of a carnival."
That's because you peroxide your hair and paint your face up like an Indian.
Part of what made Inge a good storyteller is that his young characters were invariably struggling with the desire to be someplace else. A universal coming-of-age yearning that isn't limited to Kansas, even as those of us who grew up there could relate. Yet, while the young characters in Splendor in the Grass long to be anywhere but Kansas, it never quite feels like they're in Kansas to begin with, since director Elia Kazan chose to shoot the movie near New York City. A decision that makes the story at times feel less like William Inge's world from the 1920s than an extension of The Great Gatsby's Long Island. By contrast, Picnic, based on Inge's Pulitzer-winning play of the same name, was shot entirely in Kansas. The opening shot of the movie was filmed about 20 minutes away from where I'm recording this, and its swimming scene was shot about a mile from the house where my wife Kiki grew up.
Absolutely and positively the cutest thing I ever saw.
I've been talking about how Kansas is represented in cinema for about 40 minutes now, and I've shared more than 70 clips from scripted movies and TV shows. Yet so far only 2 of them, The Learning Tree and now Picnic, were shot on location in Kansas.
I never been to Kansas before. Maybe you can tell me where Benson lives.
Picnic was nominated for a Best Picture Oscar, even as many critics complained that William Holden, who was pushing 40 at the time, was too old to play the romantic interest of Kim Novak, whose character was supposed to be 19 years old. And while shooting a movie about a place and the actual place where the story is set certainly brings a sense of authenticity to a movie, it doesn't solve the problem of verisimilitude when it comes to evoking the real story of a place on screen. As with so many other movies of that era, the Kansas we see in Picnic doesn't appear to be home to any non-white people. And, at times, the sequence depicting the Newala Festival, which was based on an actual event in William Inge's hometown, belong more to a generic and faintly sentimental Norman Rockwell vision of 1950s Americana than they do to a specific place.
Attention, everybody! Attention! The child has been found. Says he has no name. Anyone missing a child with no name can claim him here at the pavilion.
I did find something oddly familiar about the movie's pie-eating contest. Not because I had seen one growing up in Kansas, but because it was a dead ringer for a pie-eating contest from one of my favorite coming-of-age movies, one that came out when I myself was coming of age in the 1980s. Indeed, Stand By Me might have set out to evoke life in 1950s Oregon, but director Rob Reiner appears to have faithfully stolen all of its pie-eating contest details from a movie that had been made in Kansas 3 decades earlier. Watching this is a useful reminder of the fact that movies draw from other movies to create a sense of time and place, as much as they draw from the actual texture of the place where they're set. Few movies illustrate this quite so completely as the 1988 Andrew McCarthy-Matt Dillon movie Kansas, which, while it was actually filmed on location in the place it's named for, was directed by an Australian and credited to a Connecticut-born screenwriter who'd never set foot in Kansas when he wrote the script. The resulting movie feels like it was assembled by a computer algorithm that drew on half a century of time-worn Americana tropes. When the movie production arrived in Valley Falls, Kansas, its designers built vintage flourishes, things like gazebos and parade stands, in an effort to make small-town Kansas look more like what the producers thought small-town Kansas should look like. The actual bank in Valley Falls had modern features like ATMs and drive-through tellers, so producers built an old-timey Wild West-looking bank set with teller cages and a walk-in vault so that its bank robbery scene felt truer to how bank robberies were supposed to play out on screen. Though set in the 1980s, the movie begins and ends with its protagonist jumping freight trains as if it were still the Great Depression, a detail that owed less to its actual Kansas setting than to generations of movies about drifters passing through small Midwestern towns, most notably Picnic, which clearly had a huge influence on the creative team that made Kansas 3 decades later. Yet, for all of its shortcomings, this 1980s Kansas movie evokes something true about the place, even truer than The Wizard of Oz, I'd wager, for the simple fact that the producers made the effort to actually shoot on location in the actual state of Kansas. The power that a filming location has over a story is borne out by a film we touched on earlier. Indeed, while its pie-eating fantasy sequence was clearly stolen from a movie shot in Kansas 3 decades before, Stand By Me is a quintessential Oregon movie, in spite of the fact that it was based on a Stephen King novella that was set in the fictional town of Castle Rock, Maine.
I was living in a small town in Oregon called Castle Rock. There were only 1,281 people, but to me it was the whole world.
Transforming the movie from a Maine story into an Oregon story was as simple as shooting the film on location in Oregon and respecting that landscape as its true cinematic setting. It is for this reason that Peter Bogdanovich's Paper Moon is remembered as a quintessential Kansas movie, even though it's based on Joe David Brown's novel Addie Pray, which is set in the Deep South.
Nothing but trouble anyway. First you charge too much, then you want to give it away.
Where are we now?
We just left Plainville. $12 for a Bible, then it's up to $24. If I stay with you, I'll spend the rest of my life in jail.
There's a deep on Lincoln. You can take me to Lincoln.
You bet I will.
As Tatum O'Neal's Addie Pray falls into a contentious relationship amid a Depression-era road trip with Ryan O'Neal's con man Mose, the starkness of the movie's western Kansas filming location, and its far-flung index of real-life Great Plains places, provides a tableau against which the two characters develop a growing connection.
Welcome back to Kansas, buddy. The heart of America. The land of wheat, corn, Bibles, and natural gas.
In Cold Blood is another quintessential Kansas movie. Because this adaptation of Truman Capote's nonfiction novel pioneered what would become known as the true crime genre, shooting it in Kansas was inseparable from the fact that it was telling a story about actual murders that had happened there. The movie's original trailer made a point of touting its connection to real-life events.
The crime depicted in Cold Blood took place inside this house. It is reenacted inside this house, so that the motion picture itself becomes a terrifyingly true story of our generation. A generation both repelled and attracted by violence.
Yet while the movie touted itself as having been filmed on location in Kansas, In Cold Blood has, 2 generations later, become something of its own cultural brand, one that regards its Kansas setting as a symbolic backdrop, a wholesome waypoint on the axis of good and evil.
I'll bring you some apple juice from the orchard after church tomorrow. Daddy just made some.
Oh, thank you, Nancy.
The people that live in this true crime Kansas have come to symbolize a kind of shattered innocence, and have less at stake dramatically than the men who passed through this place and murdered 4 people. At times, the films in this franchise have less interest in the place where the murders happened than the man who traveled there to write about them.
It's illogical to suppose there's only one killer. The Clutters were tied up. To tie them up, he'd have to put his gun down. Once he put the gun down, the Clutters would run for the hills.
I don't believe I know who you are.
The Kansas of In Cold Blood has thus become as archetypal as the Kansas of Superman or the Wizard of Oz, less a place than a stolid and virtuous counterpoint to the complexity and flamboyance of urban America. A few other movies have been shot in Kansas over the years, but not that many. In choosing to shoot her own film in Kansas, Kiki and her collaborators joined a curiously small cohort of filmmakers who've endeavored to let Kansas play itself. Granted, her movie was a short film, and short films tend to exist as a testing ground for narrative ideas, or to showcase an actor's dramatic range, or, given a larger budget, to illustrate what might be expanded into a feature-length film. But in Kiki's case, the film also illuminates what happens when you shoot a specific story in a specific landscape, and why making that effort matters. Okay, while we're on the topic of how places affect the stories we tell, here's one more thing to consider.
Hello, my name is Sasheen Littlefeather. I'm representing Marlon Brando this evening. He very regretfully cannot accept this very generous award. And the reasons for this being are the treatment of American Indians today by the film industry.
One of the most memorable moments in the history of the Oscars came in 1973, when actor Marlon Brando asked a Native American activist to speak on his behalf after he won Best Actor for his role in The Godfather. The protest took issue with Hollywood's simplistic and sensationalized portrayal of Indigenous Americans over the years. Yet it would be another quarter century before a feature film written, directed, and produced by Native Americans found mainstream distribution. Part of the charm of the Native American indie film Smoke Signals was the way its indigenous characters were well aware of how cinematic cliches had come to influence the way outsiders perceived them.
White people will run all over you if you don't look mean. You gotta look like a warrior. You gotta look like you just came back from killing a buffalo.
But our tribe never hunted buffalo, we were fishermen.
What? You want to look like you just came back from catching a fish? This ain't Dances with Salmon, you know.
The story of Smoke Signals was inseparable from where it was shot, on the Coeur d'Alene Indian Reservation in the Pacific Northwest. The screenplay was written by novelist Sherman Alexie, who has asserted that Native American literature is defined by its relationship to place.
In time for the weather report.
Buster here. One of the clouds up there looks like a horse. And the other one looks like, you know that tavern we used to go to, the log one? And that waitress there? Hola. Looks like her.
In a 2011 interview, Alexie said, quote, "You could say that every Indian's literary vision extends only as far as they can see. To presume to speak for broader geographies than what you know," he added, "is to tell stories like a white person." Understandably, much has been said over the years about the absurd inauthenticity of white actors playing Indigenous Americans in Hollywood movies, of Chuck Connors playing an Apache medicine man, or of Burt Reynolds playing a Navajo.
My father was born here in America. His father before him, and his father before him, and his father before him. Now, which of us is American?
Less has been said about the inauthenticity of Western movie geography. Of the nearly 36 mid-20th century cowboy movies with scenes set in Kansas, most of them were filmed in and around Southern California. This landscape was recycled again and again as the standard filming location for Westerns of that era, wherever in America the story was set. Hollywood also had a way of recycling a standard indigenous costume, which typically involved some combination of buckskins, beads, and feathers. This visual stereotype actually goes back to some of the earliest movie reels produced by Thomas Edison's studio in the late 19th century. These early moving pictures employed performers from Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, a vaudeville-era undertaking that toured the world and sold millions of tickets in the US and Europe. Those old 19th century vaudeville tropes didn't just influence scores of 20th century Hollywood westerns. They also branded a generic vision of the American West that showed up in well-known European movies as well, including this one, which was shot in Croatia by a German-Italian production team with a French actor playing its Apache protagonist.
Die Apachen verstehen nur wenig von der Sprache der Assiniboines. Spricht die Tochter des Bärenwaldes die Laute des weißen Mannes?
Die Assiniboines kämpfen gegen Räuber ihres Landes.
This beads and buckskins shorthand for what American Indians look like very much applied to Sasheen Littlefeather, who must have looked certifiably Apache to Marlon Brando and the rest of Hollywood, even though her real name was Maria Cruz, and she'd been born in Monterey County, California to a white mother and a Mexican-American father, neither of whom had ties to any North American indigenous communities. The idea that indigeneity is a portable identity that you perform rather than a culture that draws its character from a specific landscape hinges on the fact that, in modern societies, non-native people don't really know what they're looking at when they look at an indigenous person, or if that person is even indigenous at all. This isn't just a product of Hollywood. It's also tied up in the earliest documentary films, which tended to reduce North American indigenous cultures to their most flamboyant cultural stereotypes. Part of the problem here is that portraying indigenous rituals for mass media audiences is at odds with the way those rituals serve the community in the context of a very specific landscape. To not have a personal relationship to that place is to misapprehend the ritual. When Kansas-born filmmakers Martin and Osa Johnson traveled to the Melanesian South Pacific in the early part of the 20th century, their mission was to get footage of cannibals and headhunters. They claimed to have found cannibals on the island of Malekula in what is now the nation of Vanuatu, but in truth neither they nor their audiences were in a position to understand what they had captured on film. In 2024, Kiki and I traveled to Malekula by cargo ship and four-wheel drive to do reporting for a book I've been researching about the legacy of the travel tales the Johnsons took home from places like the South Pacific. The goal of travel writing, at least the kind of travel writing I aspire to, is not to speak on behalf of a place, so much as to acknowledge the liminal space you occupy as an outsider, describe what it feels like to be there, and, on behalf of your home audience, illuminate the stories that local people tell about themselves. For us, this meant seeking out stories the Johnsons might have missed in their quest for titillating tales about cannibals. The problem with this, as we discovered, was that most Malekulan indigenous stories are reserved for people who've been initiated in local ceremonies. Even the male performers you see here weren't privy to many of the songs and ceremonies Malekulan women shared with each other. So, as is the case in indigenous societies worldwide, what we witnessed was a watered-down ceremonial performance created for tourists by local men and boys who, in day-to-day life, wear t-shirts, use mobile phones, and, as was the case in this particular village, attend Catholic church services each Sunday. It's easy to look askance at the tourist demand for what anthropologists have deemed, quote, staged authenticity. But generations of moviegoers have also been drawn to an essentialist, pre-modern vision of how indigenous people are supposed to live. Some of the best movies about indigenous North Americans in recent years have blurred the old cinematic dichotomy of cowboys and Indians, since, at places like the Pine Ridge Reservation in the Badlands of South Dakota, many of the young Lakota Sioux who live there are quite literally cowboys. Cinema is an expression of the industrialized world, which tends to see places as interchangeable backdrops for human enterprise, whereas indigenous understandings of the world tie specific meanings to specific places, whichever costume you happen to be wearing.
How is California better than here?
'Cause Snoop Dogg's from there, Dr. Dre.
But it's fun here. There's things to do here. Eat catfish and walk around and, just walk around and look at things.
Why didn't you ever leave?
Nothing out there for me. Everything I want is here. My family, my friends. I just always believe, tend to my own garden. Let everyone else tend to theirs.
The clear affection that Reservation Dogs has for Okmulgee, Oklahoma, the capital of the Muskogee Nation where much of the show was filmed, brings us back to where I left off. And to understand why shooting a specific story in a specific landscape matters, it helps to listen to director Spike Lee's 2024 NPR interview with radio host Terry Gross.
I grew up in Brooklyn, and it was so
Where?
Sheepshead Bay.
Did you go to high school in Brooklyn?
Yes.
Where?
Sheepshead Bay.
I went to John Dewey.
Where was John Dewey?
Coney Island.
Oh, I used to go to Coney Island a lot.
Spike's avid curiosity about where in Brooklyn Terry Gross went to high school reminded me of what I do when I meet someone who's from my childhood hometown. To know whether they went to Wichita North or Wichita East, to Bishop Carroll or Collegiate Prep, immediately gives me a sense for what their world was like and how it might have connected with my own. Indeed, developing an imaginative relationship to places that have informed your life, and in particular your youth, is inseparable from the way you come to tell stories about the world.
I had a great, wonderful childhood. I mean, we forget these video games. We played street games. We weren't doing just sitting in front of television. We made up games. We played on the streets. We were running around. And the summertime was the best because it wouldn't get dark till like 9:30. So you leave the house in the morning, and you didn't have to show up till it got dark. Oh, it was joy.
Like all great storytellers, Spike Lee knows that places aren't interchangeable. Brooklyn isn't Manhattan, Bed-Stuy isn't Harlem, and intuitively knowing the difference amplifies your authority as a filmmaker. As the novelist Eudora Welty wrote, quote, "Place absorbs our earliest notice and attention. It bestows on us our original awareness. One place comprehended can make us understand other places better. Sense of place gives equilibrium. Extended, it is sense of direction too," end quote.
Did you feel emotional the first time that you drove in Sacramento? I did, and I wanted to tell you, but we weren't really talking when it happened. All those Bens I've known my whole life, stores and the whole thing.
In her book, The White Album, the great Sacramento-born essayist Joan Didion wrote, quote, "A place belongs forever to whoever claims it the hardest, remembers it the most obsessively, wrenches it from itself, shapes it, renders it, loves it so radically that he remakes it in his image." In this way, Sacramento now belongs to Lady Bird filmmaker Greta Gerwig as much as it does to Didion. Southern California's San Fernando Valley, on the other hand, belongs to Paul Thomas Andersen, who imbues the place with its own suburban glamour, which distinguishes it from the standard issue glamour tourists look for 20 miles away, just over the Santa Monica Mountains, in Beverly Hills or on the Sunset Strip. By evoking Reseda with a familiarity and fondness usually reserved for Hollywood or Venice Beach, Andersen rescues Southern California from cinematic abstraction. By California standards, Greta Gerwig's Sacramento and Paul Thomas Andersen's San Fernando Valley are backwaters. But places perceived as backwaters have their own energy, which is why Richard Linklater's love of Central Texas is so engaging to see on screen. As the philosopher Edward S. Casey asserted in his phenomenological history of place, the experience of life can't be teased apart from where it happens. To live is to live locally, he wrote. There is no knowing a place except by being in that place, a sentiment embodied by where Linklater chooses to shoot his films. Casey also noted that the word culture goes back to the Latin colere, which means to cultivate or inhabit or care for a place. To be cultural is to inhabit a place intensely enough to cultivate it, he wrote. To respond to it, to attend to it, to be true to what it offers you, end quote. In this way, Baltimore most certainly belongs to David Simon's The Wire, which, over the course of 5 TV seasons, investigates the life of a city through the lens of institutions like industry and law enforcement and education and city government. David Simon was an outspoken critic of the notion that American stories need to be filtered through places like New York or Hollywood, declaring, quote, "My impulses are the reaction of any writer who lives in close proximity to a specific American experience, and who are trying to capture that experience for his audience. I don't mean this to come off as some snotty declaration of pseudo-proletarian pretension," he added, "but it is what it is. I live in Baltimore." Nebraska native Alexander Payne has expressed a similar attitude towards Omaha, where he set and filmed his first 3 movies. "If you're trying to recreate life, the life you best know is the one you grew up with," he told the New York Times in 2002. "I hadn't seen the Midwest in a movie. I wanted to see it. It was as simple as that." For election, this meant moving Tom Perrotta's novel from New Jersey to Omaha. For About Schmidt, it meant moving Louis Begley's novel to Nebraska from the Hamptons. Schmidt is the most Omaha of my films, Payne told the Times. Have I gotten it right? I'm not sure. Did Fellini get Rome right? Oftentimes, places belong to the filmmakers who sharpen their craft in New York or Los Angeles, not to tell stories about those cities, but to put those places into conversation with the landscapes that form their earlier lives and imaginations. The most ardent cinematic champion of Kansas in recent years has been Kevin Wilmot, who studied dramatic writing at New York University, but grew up in Junction City, a hardscrabble town near the Army base that houses the U.S. 1st Infantry Division. 9th Street, his first movie, evoked that part of Kansas at a time when black market commerce and the presence of Vietnam-bound soldiers made it notorious for vice.
Sometimes I wonder if I ever should have come down here on 9th Street. But I love the life here, the powerful nourishment it gave me, and I wanted to take that nourishment to my parishioners.
Wilmot's screenwriting collaboration with Spike Lee on Black Klansman eventually won him a Best Adapted Screenplay Oscar in 2019. But his own directorial efforts have kept him based in Kansas. In 2020, he told an interviewer, quote, "The big thing I learned from Spike Lee was that I had to go back home to make my films. Spike worked with people in New York, but I didn't know anybody in New York, and the people in New York didn't really want to tell my stories. So I went back to Kansas, where people knew the stories I was trying to tell." The thing is, for every Oscar-nominated filmmaker like Kevin Wilmot or Greta Gerwig or Richard Linklater, local filmmaking scenes everywhere have people who make movies in their spare time out of simple obsession. Filmmakers with no connections to Hollywood who tell stories set and shot in certain places because they live in those places.
Call me!
For more than 2 decades now, I've been watching the Wichita movies of Roderick Pokawatchit, who puts his own spin on what Native American movies look like, including a satirical horror movie that has fun with the conceit that indigenous Americans are the only people who happen to have genetic resistance to a certain zombie virus.
Take your paws off him, you damn dirty zombie.
Wichita is also home to filmmakers like Devon Bray, whose movies put a human face to the joys and idiosyncrasies of African American life in a Midwestern city that doesn't often figure in the movies that coastal filmmakers tell about the Black American experience. Emily Railsback, who worked with Kiki on the game camera, has directed other films on location in Kansas, including a story where Kiki plays a Mennonite schoolteacher struggling with a law requiring that she keep a gun in her classroom. Ultimately, being cinematically true to a place isn't about the place alone. It's about the passion and sincerity a given creator brings to that place. One of the best depictions of Kansas in recent memory is Kansas-born Bridget Everett's HBO dramedy Somebody Somewhere, which, for a combination of budget and logistical reasons, was shot in exurban Chicago, but imbues its vision of Kansas with a narrative nuance rarely seen on screen.
And I am home.
Bridget actually sent video testimony for state-level film subsidies around the same time Kiki gave her speech before the legislature in Topeka.
I am so happy to hear that Kansas is considering a film incentives bill. This is critical to bring productions into Kansas. It will create jobs and opportunity, and most importantly, let the world see how beautiful Kansas is.
Kevin Wilmot spoke before the legislature in Topeka the same week Kiki did. His testimony touched on the dynamics of where he wrote his Oscar-winning screenplay, and he hinted at what could be the solution for filmmakers who want real-life places to play a more dynamic role in the stories cinema tells about life in America.
I wrote that screenplay in Lawrence, Kansas, not in Hollywood, California. Every day from my home in Lawrence, I Zoom with production companies and major studios about projects they want me to write. In years past, when I traveled to Los Angeles for a meeting with a studio, they'd always start with, "So, where do you live, New York or LA?" When I said Kansas, there were always jokes and explanations. I no longer must do that because on Zoom, many of them are no longer in Los Angeles.
It's worth pointing out here that technology, coupled with the local availability of trained film technicians, has always had a huge influence over where movies are filmed and who is able to work on them. Though New York City is considered an iconic cinematic landscape, few movies set there were actually shot there in the early to middle part of the 20th century. For decades, between the mid-1910s and the late 1950s, the New York you saw on screen wasn't New York at all. It was, apart from the occasional establishing shot, a simulation of New York built on a soundstage in Southern California. It wasn't until the latter part of the 1950s that high-speed film stock, coupled with lightweight cameras and synchronous sound audio recording, allowed directors to shoot fast and dirty out on the actual streets of the city rather than on the backlot. The boom of classic independent film set in New York in the 1970s was in part an artistic achievement on the part of visionary storytellers, but it was just as much a technical achievement, the groundwork for which had been laid over the course of the previous 2 decades, as new advancements in filmmaking technology expanded the notion of how and where one could shoot a movie. Now, more than ever, where we make movies need not be confined to a handful of locations in major American cities. This doesn't just apply to where a movie can be filmed. Most aspects of production can now be uncoupled from Hollywood's centralization, including Kiki's audition process. Whereas auditions were once confined to production offices in Los Angeles or New York, Kiki now does self-tape auditions from wherever she happens to be, whether that means our home in rural Kansas, or, as was the case when I was researching my book in the South Pacific last year, taping an audition from a village church on the island of Urapiv in Vanuatu, a place with no grid electricity or indoor plumbing, but, thanks to smartphone technology and a passably neutral background wall, was a place where she could try out for a guest role on NBC's Law & Order from 8,500 miles away. So let's make the magic happen. Among the many issues raised in the Screen Actors Guild strike of 2023, one was pushback against, quote, geographic discrimination, whereby actors who reside outside of New York and Los Angeles are offered lesser terms for the same role. The Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers ultimately rejected this proposal, but the fact that it even made the list of demands means that the entertainment industry is beginning to broaden its sense for which places do and don't matter. But even as new technologies allow us to portray our humanity on location almost anywhere, another innovation threatens to dehumanize our stories in a literal way. A key concern in the 2023 actors' strike was, quote, replacement of human performances by AI technology.
We will not be having our jobs taken away and giving to robots.
At this moment in history, it feels like whatever I say about artificial intelligence is going to sound outdated almost immediately. But as unsettling as new developments in AI simulation might feel, storytellers will use them whenever these tools prove cheaper and easier than organic reality. This is, after all, why sound stages stood in for real-life places in the past, and why AI-generated landscapes will do so in the future. My final point, both as an artist and a person who loves Kansas, is this. However movies wind up depicting places, all places contain multitudes, which is why no place should be perceived through a single story. Especially a story that has no connection to the place in question. Dorothy's Kansas wasn't really Kansas, it was a California soundstage. But her ultimate realization remains true. There's no place like home. As artists, it's our duty to honor our homes as authentically as possible, so the world might understand those places in new and nuanced ways.
They say the wheat fields roll forever, underneath that big blue sky. But when the cameras started rolling, honey, they take my name and say goodbye. Out in Cali they paint the sunsets. Up in Canada they fake my planes. They call it home on the range, sugar, but it's not me. They just use my name, 'cause Kansas never plays herself. She's always cast as someone else. They take her wind and paint it gold and sell a story secondhand and cold. From Ice to Smallville, I can tell Kansas never plays herself. Dorothy clicked them ruby slippers, said, we're not in Kansas anymore. But truth is, sweetheart, she never was. That yellow brick road was a Hollywood floor. They trade my storms for desert thunder, my fields for some Spanish hill. And every time they roll the credits, it's my heart they try to steal. Yeah, Kansas never plays herself. She's always cast as someone else. They borrow my wind, they fake my rain, dress up my dirt in another state's name. They use my story, but not my smell. Kansas never plays herself. I got sky that stretches past forever. I got ghosts in my prairie towns, but they chase those city tax incentives while my main streets all shut down. You can't fake that kind of lonely. You can't buy that kind of great. But they'll build me out in Burbank and call it the Heartland's face. Kansas never plays herself. She's always lost on someone's shelf. They love her name, but not her view. They love her myth, not her truth. So if Hollywood comes ringing, well, tell them Kansas don't need help. She's fine playing herself. Yeah, when Dorothy told Toto her little black ball of fur, she said, Toto,